In our last video, we reported the discoveries from the CheckIron project, which is a citizen science project where people are contributing their DNA, and we are actually analysing that in terms of when they tell us they got ill from hemochromatosis. And we've had a lot of success in that, and I recommend seeing that video to find out more information. In this video, we want to explain where we should go next based on those findings. And we can split it into 4 things, and this will be 4 videos. This first one is about increased awareness. The second is about near zero cost DNA screening, and we'll explain why that's now possible. Then the third video will be comprehensive DNA analysis, because this is now possible, and we believe doctors should start looking at the consumer DNA data. And fourthly, there's a real controversy about adding iron to food and other additives as well, because this leads to giving poisons in terms of unmeasured iron consumption. Say, for example, if you eat too many bowls of Kellogg's cornflakes, you can get an overdose of iron, and this is just ridiculous. Anyway, let's get into this video, which is about increased awareness. And by awareness, we mean awareness in hemochromatosis, which is iron overload, as well as awareness of too much iron in the body. And this can happen by eating too much or just with age, because as we age, we have less control over the iron that we're eating and what's absorbed, because the gut becomes less good at preventing poisons going through into the bloodstream. So this is why we need to be more aware of both the importance of iron and too much iron, as well as hemochromatosis itself. Now, I want to get into some detail about the fact that within hemochromatosis, there are hugely differing views from different groups of people. And this shocked me when I first got into the subject, because to me, some of these things are obvious, and some of the things being said were obviously wrong. Now, why did this happen? And I want to talk about multiple truths. Here I've listed 3 possibilities for the truth about hemochromatosis. The first is that you get a truth based on outdated information. What happens in a field like iron overload hemochromatosis is you can get experts, and as they get older, they become more expert, more knowledgeable about their subject, but they might actually not keep up with what's going on in the science about that subject. And you can get their truths can be actually based on outdated information. And this has happened within hemochromatosis simply because the gene itself wasn't discovered till 1996. And then a lot of research was done in around the 2010 type period. And then since then, very little has been done apart from our own research, which has looked at large amounts of data. Secondly, you can get the truth based on non-scientific, made-up information. And it's very easy for a doctor who isn't really often very highly trained in science to be able to keep up with the actual scientific information which is being published all the time. And we have some cases, unfortunately, where doctors have got grouped together and made up, based on their observations, something which is not scientific. And then the third one is the truth based on the latest scientific knowledge and data. And again, there's no guarantee that this is the final story. As in our case, we have the latest information, but one day there might actually be later information which is even more correct. And this has happened throughout science. You have something called Newtonian physics based on Newton's work in the 1600s, which worked incredibly well, was very well taken and aboard and well respected. But in the early 1900s, Einstein came along and showed that it wasn't right in certain circumstances. So Newtonian physics is still right, but Einsteinian physics is more right, and is more right in the more complicated, more detailed way. Now, let's go back to 1865, because in that year, two things happened. Firstly, Gregor Mendel published his book about genetics and the pea plants, and we see him saying that recessive conditions require two genes or two mutations to actually have the effect. And this is still true. This is still a true fact, but under certain conditions, it's not true. And we'll look in more detail about this in a minute. And the other thing that happened in 1865, a Frenchman called Mendel Trousseau discovered a syndrome he called bronze diabetes, which we now know to be hemochromatosis. But the interesting thing is, that wasn't the end of the story, because even up until 1920, half of the doctors involved in hemochromatosis thought that hemochromatosis was due to too much alcohol. And indeed, in some cases, you could get iron overload from too much alcohol, and still can today. But half of the doctors, there was no acceptance of the fact that there was some genetic influence, some family relationship to who got hemochromatosis and which people were drinking too much. And the controversy remains today, really, because there's a lot of misinformation about hemochromatosis, simply because it's a lack of understanding and to some extent a lack of research into the condition. So now we know there are multiple truths. What are the false truths of the multiple truths? And the amazing thing is there actually, you can identify groups of people who have each of the false truths. So the first is what I call the old guard. These are doctors that have been researching hemochromatosis for 30 or 40 years and have formed a view which was affected by what the knowledge was at the time when they did that initial research, which we now know to be incorrect. So, for example, they say women don't get hemochromatosis and that only homozygous C282Y exists as a disease, and that's why we call that one classic hemochromatosis. Now, let me show you some examples of this. First of all, I'm going to show you Dr. Paul Adams talking about other doctors making big mistakes in regards to women.
The worst scenario is when doctors make mistakes of commission rather than omission. Like the doctor that I told you about earlier, that told the woman who was just diagnosed with the genetic test that it doesn't occur in women and that there's no genetic test. That's a troublesome behavior in a doctor.
And now I'm going to show you Dr. Paul Adams making a mistake himself about the rarity of the non-HFE iron overload conditions. And then his comments that because it's so rare, there's no point in doing the testing, which is sort of self-fulfilling prophecy that means that it will never be found not to be rare, as is the case for hemochromatosis type 3, where no one tests for it.
I mentioned to you that non-HFE iron overload is very rare. And these environmental causes are more common, like the metabolic syndrome, daily alcohol, and obesity. And I posed the question to you, would you be interested in paying for a genetic test that has 1 in 2 million chance of being positive? And what if it was positive? Would you feel better? Would you feel that was helpful? It might give you an opportunity to see how your health would compare to a small number of people that have been reported who also have the same genetic test positive. That's why we name diseases, so you can sort of follow patterns.
Well, that does sound reasonable, doesn't it, at first hearing? But the reality is his 1 in 2 million number is made up. He made it up. It's not published anywhere. In fact, no one knows exactly what those numbers are. But I can tell you, we know that type 3, hemochromatosis type 3, is nearly as common as type 1. And even type 2, although it's rare, which the definition of rare for medical conditions is less than 1 in 2,000. It is rare because we think it's something like 1 in 3,000. And the others, like type 4, I have no idea what it is. It could actually be 1 in 2 million, but I do believe he's just made that up. Anyway, a further example of basing conclusions on outdated information is the next talk from Dr. Paul Adams, where he's talking about genetics and the recessive gene.
The genetics, I mentioned it earlier, this is an autosomal recessive disease. And many patients and many doctors too have kind of forgotten what this means. But the essence of it is that it's got to be on both sides of your family. It's got to be on your mother's side and your father's side. So when I see a new patient in the clinic who's a C282Y homozygote, I ask about the ancestry of their partner. I like to ask them whether they met their wife at a family reunion.
So I can tell you the recessive gene argument is incorrect, and I think we've already discussed this in a separate video about polygenic diseases. Hemochromatosis is a polygenic disease. It needs a number of genes. Obviously, in many cases, it's the HFE gene which is dominating, but other genes are involved, and we think even the immune system is involved, with all the genes involved in the inflammatory diseases. So the whole thing is incorrect. It's a massive oversimplification of Gregor Mendel's rules, and it's just become outdated. Then there's another group of doctors who are a bit younger, but they're still actually slightly wrong. They say that you can take that, but add in other forms of hemochromatosis based on the HFE gene mutations. So they allow homozygous H63D and compound mix of C282Y and H63D. And then they say women can get hemochromatosis after menopause. Now, a more modern, slightly even more modern thinking doctor would then say carriers can have hemochromatosis, but must have another gene we don't know about yet, which is actually causing it. And we call this non-HFE hemochromatosis. And they would also say women get it later than men. So all of that is wrong, according to me. And so what is our truth? What is CheckIron's truth? And I must admit, I need to admit that even this could one day be considered slightly wrong or partially right, and with a further truth coming out in the future. But this is our view today. Hemochromatosis is a polygenic disease. That means there's more than one gene involved, and therefore carriers can overload. Now, this isn't controversial in the least, because biologists quickly realized after Gregor Mendel discovered his rules that they didn't work if more than one gene was involved. And this is why we have this term called polygenic disease. And we know for a fact, scientifically, that hemochromatosis is a polygenic disease. But the amazing thing is doctors don't seem to have heard of this modification of the science rules. Then, secondly, there are actually 5 types of hemochromatosis based on 5 genes. And even though type 1, which is based on HFE, is the most common, type 3, based on TFR2, is not rare and nearly as common as type 1. And furthermore, we find something like 19% of our users have both type 1 and type 3. Now, the next point is that hemochromatosis has other genes which change the speed of loading, and therefore this actually changes the age at which they get sick. And finally, we found that hemochromatosis is affected by other metabolic diseases. These are the inflammatory diseases or the diseases of aging. Furthermore, hemochromatosis can actually cause metabolic diseases such as diabetes and be caused by these diseases as well. So it works in both directions and everything is connected. In fact, hemochromatosis is a metabolic disease itself. So up to now, I've been a bit negative about awareness, but what I was trying to do is explain why awareness is really difficult for hemochromatosis. It's actually because the facts are so varied in different groups of people. Anyway, I want to finish on a positive note, and I'll show you one more video, but much more positive in the sense of the importance of iron and the effect on aging. Now, this is Dr. David Sinclair, who works at the Harvard Medical School, and he's an expert on aging and has done many discoveries, and I do believe that one day he'll win a Nobel Prize for his work. Now, listen to what he says. He says iron is important for aging. It causes aging, and even people with excess iron, too much, but not having the hemochromatosis gene are at risk. So listen carefully and we'll talk at the end.
Not eat, right. To live a long time. And it was remiss of me not to bring up a pernicious element called iron. Pernicious? Yeah, it's one of the elements that is turning out to be quite a dangerous element to having or too much of in your body. Increasingly, we see that people who have high levels of iron have accelerated aging. Okay, yeah, but iron is essential, right? We all need iron. In fact, people will supplement with iron a lot of times. Right. Well, we need iron. It's a major component of hemoglobin, which carries oxygen, which we need. But the levels don't need to be as high as we once thought. In fact, people who live a long time and have these diets that are recommended, I typically see they have lower levels of iron and lower levels of hemoglobin. And this is not necessarily a bad thing. Conversely, people who have very high levels, either genetically, hemochromatosis, or take a supplement and end up with high levels of iron, might be predisposing themselves to accelerated aging. Okay, so what about this plays into your idea about why people should limit their meat intake, though, because meat is high in iron, especially red meats, are higher in iron. That's one aspect. But typically, if people are taking multivitamin with high levels of iron, this could be a really bad thing. It'll accumulate in tissues. And we know now that particularly ferrous iron leads to the production of free radicals that damage tissues in the body. And even worse, it leads to the accumulation of these zombie cells, which we call senescent cells. And those drive the aging process, in large part, because they leach these inflammatory molecules that cause other cells in the vicinity to become inflamed, to age, to senesce, and even cause cancer. Let's back up for a second here, because I think we're going to talk more about senescent cells in a coming episode, but we have mentioned free radicals before, and I think that's a word that gets thrown around a lot.
And maybe not everybody understands free radicals.
Right. And we're not just talking about people in Portland, Oregon.
Or Eugene, or Berkeley.
Yeah. So these are free radicals. These have been around for millions of years, of course, and we've known about them for at least the last 70. There are three main types of free radicals. There's the superoxide molecule, which is quite damaging. It can lead to what are called advanced glycation end products, which are basically proteins that are damaged. It's one of the reasons you want to fast sometimes during the day to get rid of these damaged proteins. There's a superoxide anion, it's called, which creates most of the oxidative stress in the body. And then there's a third one, hydrogen peroxide, which you can buy a bottle of and dye your hair blonde or orange, as my hair went during the pandemic. Those three things are really bad.
You dyed your hair during the pandemic?
I got bored, just dyed it.
How did it look?
Horrible. It really went orange. I've been dyeing it ever since just to cover it up, but it's almost gone, thank goodness. But this is where iron comes in. When you have a superoxide molecule, it'll be turned into peroxide by an enzyme called superoxide dismutase, which is extremely important to get rid of that superoxide, which is going to damage the cell. But then you get hydrogen peroxide, and we know how bad that is. Look at my hair. You don't want that circulating. So then what happens is there's a molecule called glutathione, which will turn that into water. But if you have too much iron around, there won't be enough chance to detoxify it, and it'll be turned into this hydroxyl radical. And that's a really damaging molecule that goes on to damage your DNA, your RNA, lipids, proteins, and drive aging and senescence. So you want to have iron enough not to be lethargic, to have enough oxygen transported, but not super high levels that'll cause accelerated aging.
And this is going to be different for different people. 10% of the population in the United States has the HFE gene, which makes them more susceptible to hemochromatosis, which means they have to be even more concerned. You can't know this without knowing if you carry this gene, though, right? I mean,
right. You do need to measure things, and that's why I recommend people measure their blood biochemistry and determine whether their iron, whether it's free iron, which is the worst type, or even the bound iron, are out of whack. And you can correct for that. In the case of a normal person, I would say don't take an iron supplement necessarily, although women may need it certain times of the month. But people who have hemochromatosis, they're particularly susceptible to aging. And the recommendation typically of a doctor is donate blood if you can.
Okay, so just to go over what we talked about last time really quickly, you advocate for a plant-based diet. You advocate for low iron levels. What am I missing?
Well, we're going to talk about that today. What type of exercise works best?
Oh, I was just talking about how we should eat, but yeah.
Well, we eat less often.
Eat less often.
Yeah, so I've gone from not eating breakfast now to not eating lunch as well, and just focus on dinner, and giving my body a rest from food overnight and through the middle of the day so that it turns on our defensive genes against aging. Those three buckets, the mTOR, which senses amino acids, or lack thereof, the AMPK, which senses energy, which is glucose mainly, and the sirtuins, which I work on, that sense all of those things, including exercise. And those three protective mechanisms we can turn on by eating the right things, eating less often, and exercising.
Well, that was interesting, wasn't it? It does make me very hopeful about awareness when you have such an expert telling us about it. So we all want to, I'd recommend everyone talks about this a bit more and realizes that it affects more than just people with a faulty gene. So thanks for watching. Our next video is about population screening, and we've got similar sort of problems with that. About decisions have been made in the past based on information which turns out now to be incorrect. And so I look forward to being able to tell you the story, the history of population screening, and why, in fact, population screening would actually help, and how it could help at a low cost. As always, please like and subscribe, and look forward to the next video.